Louis heard his mother calling from downstairs before she even reached the top of the staircase. Her voice carried that unmistakable hurried edge that meant she was already halfway through her evening plans and had no patience left for arguments. "Louis, come on. We have to go." He leaned back in his gaming chair with a sigh, pulling one ear of his headset aside. The bright glow of his monitor faded as he glanced toward the bedroom doorway. He had just settled into a match and was finally starting to enjoy himself. "Hope you have fun," he shouted back casually, already preparing to return his attention to the game. A second later, his bedroom door swung open. His mother stood there with one hand on her hip and her car keys dangling from the other. "Nice try. You know exactly how this works." Louis groaned dramatically. "Why can't I stay home alone for once? I'm 14, not 4. I can heat up leftovers." His mom gave him the same look she always did whenever this conversation happened. "We've already discussed this. I'm not leaving you here by yourself all evening. The Garners are expecting you. But I'll literally just sit here quietly." "That's exactly what worries me," she replied dryly. "Now hurry up. We're late already." Defeated, Louis exited the game, ignored the annoyed messages from his teammates, and dragged himself downstairs. Outside, the evening air still held the warmth of the late afternoon sun. Across the lawn, the Garner's SUV was already parked with the engine running. Mr. Garner loaded a few overnight bags into the trunk, while Mrs. Garner greeted Louis's mother with cheerful enthusiasm. Mrs. Garner turned toward the house and called loudly, "Priscilla, Louis is here." Louis tried not to smile at the name. Priscilla sounded like someone who should live in a castle and write poetry with a feather pen, not someone who climbed fences and once convinced him to jump into a freezing lake on a dare. A moment later, Priscilla, who absolutely refused to let anyone call her that unless they were adults, came jogging around from the backyard. "Hey, Louis." She grabbed his wrist before he could even respond properly and tugged him toward the backyard gate. "Missy's already setting everything up," she announced excitedly. Melissa, better known as Missy, was dragging a plastic kiddie pool across the grass with surprising determination. Another pool already sat several feet away, filled with shallow water that reflected the orange glow of the sunset. Louis raised an eyebrow. "Please tell me you're not planning a swimming party at sunset." Missy grinned mischievously. "Not swimming. Competition." Prissy pointed proudly toward the pools. "We invented a game." "That sentence never ends well," Louis muttered. Ignoring him completely, Prissy launched into the explanation. "One person stands in the middle. The other two stay inside the pools and toss the ball back and forth. The middle player has 3 minutes to steal it. And if they fail," Missy added dramatically, "they get a forfeit." Louis folded his arms. "Like what?" Prissy shrugged innocently. "Anything harmless and embarrassing." Missy immediately chimed in. "Last week Prissy had to sing nursery rhymes while hopping on one foot." Prissy pointed accusingly. "And you had to wear oven mitts for 2 rounds." Louis tried not to laugh. The game began after a quick round of rock, paper, scissors decided teams. Louis ended up facing off against Prissy first, while Missy joined him from the opposite pool. At first it seemed ridiculously easy. Then Prissy started moving. She darted across the grass like a soccer player defending a goal, lunging between passes and forcing Louis and Missy to fake throws just to keep the ball away from her. Water splashed every time Louis shifted inside the slippery plastic pool, and twice he nearly lost his balance trying to throw around her. "Panicking already?" Missy teased as she lobbed the ball toward him. Louis caught it against his chest. "Not even close." Prissy lunged instantly. He barely managed to toss the ball back before she grabbed it. The 3-minute timer somehow felt both endless and incredibly short. By the time it buzzed from the porch steps, Prissy collapsed dramatically into the grass. "No, I lost." Louis raised both arms triumphantly. "Forfeit." Prissy sat up cautiously. "Okay, fine. What is it?" Louis thought for a moment before smirking. "You have to wear oven mitts for the next round." Missy burst out laughing so hard she doubled over. Prissy stared at him in disbelief. "You monster." A few minutes later, she was helplessly trying to catch the ball with giant padded mitts while Louis nearly fell over laughing every time she fumbled a pass. From there, the challenges became more ridiculous with every round. Missy had to recite tongue twisters whenever she caught the ball. Louis was forced to hop on one foot during an entire match and nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Prissy wore a floppy sun hat that kept sliding over her eyes at the worst possible moments. Someone had to throw every pass backward. Someone else had to spin twice before touching the ball. At one point, all three of them were laughing too hard to continue because Missy accidentally launched the ball straight into a bush while attempting a dramatic underhand throw. The game stopped feeling competitive after a while. Instead, it became one long chain of ridiculous moments, non-stop teasing, and challenges designed purely to make each other laugh harder. By the time the sun started dipping lower in the sky, all three of them were exhausted and sprawled around the pools trying to catch their breath. Prissy checked the time and grinned suddenly. "We still have forever before dinner." Louis narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Why do I feel like that sentence is dangerous?" Missy's grin widened. "Because now the game moves inside." The moment they entered the house, the sisters immediately scattered with purpose. Prissy disappeared into her bedroom while Missy returned carrying an enormous box overflowing with random costume accessories. Scarves, old hats, cheap sunglasses, feather boas, a couple of brightly colored wigs. Louis immediately backed away. "Absolutely not. You still owe forfeits," Missy reminded him. "That doesn't mean fashion crimes." Too late. Within minutes, they had transformed the bedroom floor into complete chaos. A sparkly feather boa ended up draped around Louis's shoulders, while Prissy forced an oversized sequin top hat onto his head. "There," she announced proudly. "You look like a magician who lost a bet." Missy nearly dropped her phone laughing as Louis reluctantly struck dramatic poses. "Give me your best runway expression," she ordered. Louis narrowed his eyes dramatically and placed one hand on his hip. Prissy gasped. "Oh no, he's actually good at this." Soon the sisters were taking turns wearing absurd combinations too. Missy stacked 3 hats on top of each other until she could barely see. Prissy wrapped herself in so many scarves she looked like a walking blanket fort. Louis narrated everything in an exaggerated documentary voice. Here we see modern fashion embracing emotional confusion and laundry-based inspiration. Missy collapsed sideways onto the rug laughing. The entire evening blurred into pure silliness after that. They moved into the living room for a movie marathon, still wearing random costume pieces because nobody could be bothered taking them off. Louis remained stuck with the ridiculous glittering top hat. "It's your signature look now," Prissy informed him seriously. They sprawled across the couch with bowls of popcorn balanced between them while an animated adventure movie played on the television. Naturally, they couldn't simply watch it normally. Every missed popcorn toss became another challenge. 1 miss meant switching seats. 2 misses meant singing the next song that appeared in the movie. 3 misses meant dramatic reenactments. At one point, Louis ended up performing an emotional musical number while Missy used a broom like a violin and Prissy conducted the entire performance with a TV remote. Halfway through the movie, the doorbell rang. "That's dinner," Missy shouted, already heading toward the kitchen. "Then you answer it," Louis said immediately. Prissy shook her head without looking away from the television. "Nope. You still owe me 1 mini forfeit." Louis already knew he wouldn't like where this was going. Prissy grabbed the feather boa from beside the couch and tossed it directly at him. "You must answer the door wearing the hat and this." Louis stared at her in horror. "You cannot be serious." "The rules are sacred," Missy called from the kitchen. Louis groaned louder than necessary, but reluctantly wrapped the boa around his shoulders anyway. When he opened the front door, the delivery driver blinked once at his outfit before smiling. "Well," she said carefully, handing him the food bags, "that's definitely a look." Louis felt his face heating instantly. "A theme night." She laughed softly. "Honestly, the hat works for you." Louis shut the door the second she walked away while Prissy and Missy exploded into hysterics behind him. Dinner turned into another extension of the chaos. They spread everything across the living room floor picnic style while continuing the movie, pausing every few minutes to quote lines dramatically or argue over favorite scenes. By the time the credits rolled, empty wrappers and cups were scattered everywhere, and all three of them were half buried against the couch cushions in exhausted satisfaction. Missy stretched her arms overhead and grinned. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this might officially be one of our best game nights ever." Louis looked around at the ridiculous mess, the feather boa still around his shoulders, the crooked top hat on his head, the remains of popcorn everywhere, and realized she was probably right. It wasn't how he planned to spend his evening. But somehow, between the ridiculous forfeits, the endless laughter, and the complete nonsense of the entire night, it had turned into something far better than sitting alone in his room staring at a screen. And deep down, though he would never admit it out loud, Louis was already hoping there'd be another game night next week. "I've still got enough energy left for one final challenge tonight," Missy announced dramatically, pointing across the living room like a game show host preparing a grand finale. "And this one is going to be legendary." Louis narrowed his eyes immediately. "Why do I suddenly feel threatened?" "Because," Prissy said with far too much excitement, "your last forfeit is officially being redeemed." Missy crossed her arms with exaggerated seriousness. "And before you ask, yes, it's completely non-negotiable." Louis leaned back against the couch cushion cautiously. "Okay, what exactly am I supposed to do?" Prissy grinned like she'd been waiting for this moment all evening. "You have to invent the most ridiculous bedtime outfit possible and actually wear it." Louis blinked once. That's it, Missy confirmed. "But it has rules." "Of course it does." Prissy immediately began digging through the overflowing costume box beside the couch. "The outfit needs at least 3 completely unrelated themes." Louis laughed. "What does that even mean?" "It means," she explained while tossing random items onto the carpet, "you can't just wear pajamas and call it a day. It needs chaos, artistic confusion, fashion nonsense." Missy snapped her fingers. "Exactly. Like superhero pajamas mixed with circus magician energy. And maybe woodland creature accessories," Prissy added thoughtfully. Louis already knew resistance was pointless. 5 minutes later, the result was somehow even worse than he imagined. He stood in the hallway staring at himself in the mirror while the girls collapsed into hysterics behind him. Plaid pajama pants, fuzzy watermelon print socks, a glittering green superhero cape tied around his neck, the ridiculous sequin top hat from earlier, and perched crookedly on top of everything, a pair of floppy bunny ears. Louis tried to maintain some dignity for approximately 2 seconds before laughing at himself. "I look like a children's TV character who got rejected for being too confusing." Prissy wiped tears from her eyes. "No, you look magnificent." Missy pointed dramatically. "That right there is peak bedtime fashion." Louis gave a theatrical bow, the cape fluttering behind him. "Thank you. I call this collection Sleepwalker Supreme." "Perfect," Prissy declared instantly. "Now we need the official ending photo." They spent the next few minutes balancing Missy's phone against a stack of books on the coffee table while arguing about camera angles and timer settings. "Everyone squeeze closer," Missy ordered. "You're literally sitting on my arm," Louis complained. "That's the price of friendship." The timer began counting down. 3, 2, 1, flash. They changed poses immediately. Another flash. Prissy threw up dramatic peace signs. Louis pointed heroically into the distance with one hand while trying not to lose the bunny ears. Third flash. Then all 3 of them crowded around the phone to review the results. "Oh, this one wins," Prissy announced immediately. It was the middle picture. Louis's cape had somehow caught mid-swing, making him look bizarrely heroic despite the watermelon socks and rabbit ears. Missy was laughing with her eyes closed while Prissy leaned halfway out of frame, trying to pose dramatically. "It's going into the Game Night Legends album," Missy declared. Louis rolled his eyes but couldn't stop smiling. The truth was, the entire evening had turned out nothing like he expected. When his mother first dragged him over earlier, he'd been convinced it would just be another boring babysitting night filled with awkward small talk and endless boredom. Instead, he'd spent hours laughing so hard his stomach hurt. Somewhere between the backyard games, ridiculous forfeits, costume disasters, and movie challenges, the whole night had transformed into something unforgettable. Eventually, they started cleaning up the chaos around the living room. Feather boas disappeared back into boxes. Empty food containers were gathered from under the couch. Missy tossed random costume pieces toward the hallway, while Prissy tried folding blankets with dramatic exhaustion. Then Prissy glanced at the clock. "We've got 20 minutes until official bedtime." Missy's eyes lit up instantly. "That means there's time for one final lightning round." Louis groaned playfully. "You people are incapable of ending a night normally." "Correct," Missy said proudly. Prissy jumped onto the rug in the center of the room. "New rules. No props. No costumes. Pure creativity." Louis crossed his arms. "What's the challenge?" Missy grinned. "We invent the funniest nonsense word possible and use it naturally in a sentence." Louis stared at her. "That's the game? That's the game." 5 minutes later, the three of them were barely functioning from laughter. Prissy dramatically accused Louis of over-flibbering the toaster. Missy insisted her imaginary word snorptacular sounded like a real dictionary term. Louis countered by creating a sentence so absurd none of them could even repeat it afterward without cracking up again. The competition quickly stopped mattering. Like every other game that night, it became less about winning and more about keeping the laughter going as long as possible. Eventually, the house settled into quieter energy. The television was off. The costume boxes were mostly packed away. The kitchen lights glowed softly down the hallway. And for a brief moment, all three of them simply sat there on the living room floor surrounded by the leftover chaos of game night. It didn't feel like an ending, more like pressing pause. Later that evening, Louis's mother finally arrived to pick him up. When Louis opened the front door, he was still wearing the watermelon socks and the glittering green cape. His mom stopped mid-step. She looked at the outfit, then at him, then at the sisters standing behind him, trying desperately not to laugh. "Should I ask?" Louis considered explaining the entire sequence of events. The waiting pools, the forfeits, the fashion show, the movie penalties, the bedtime costume finale. Instead, he simply shrugged. "You probably had to be there." His mother laughed softly and shook her head. "I'm almost afraid to know." Louis waved goodbye to the girls before climbing into the car. As they pulled away, he could still see Missy and Prissy standing on the porch grinning like they'd successfully completed some secret mission. The next morning arrived slowly and quietly. Golden sunlight slipped through the curtains in soft streaks, warming the room in that peaceful way mornings sometimes do after a late night. Louis stirred awake, confused for a second by the unfamiliar ceiling. Then he noticed the glittering green cape tangled near his feet. Memory hit instantly. The games, the costumes, the ridiculous challenges. He laughed quietly to himself. From downstairs came the muffled sound of voices. Prissy and Missy were clearly already awake and already arguing about something completely unimportant. It sounded oddly comforting. Louis rolled out of bed and shuffled into the hallway wearing the watermelon socks again because apparently those had become part of his identity now. The smell of cinnamon drifted through the house. He followed it into the kitchen where chaos was already unfolding. Missy stood on a chair flipping through a cookbook while holding a mixing spoon like a conductor's baton. Prissy guarded the toaster suspiciously as if someone might steal it. "We're making breakfast," Missy announced. Louis glanced around carefully. "Why do I feel like there's another challenge attached to this?" "Because there is," Prissy said immediately. She slid a bowl toward him. "Mini marshmallows." Louis blinked. "That's concerning." "Breakfast challenge rules," Missy explained dramatically. "Everyone gets assigned one secret ingredient chosen by the others. And yours," Prissy added proudly, "is marshmallows." The kitchen quickly transformed into complete disaster.